There's something Carl Jung discovered about human suffering that will change how you see every difficult year you've endured. The people who go through the hardest experiences don't just survive them. They develop capabilities that people who have lived easier lives can never access. Jung found that psychological suffering, when fully faced and integrated, doesn't just wound you, it forges you into something that didn't exist before. And if you've been through years that broke you, years that isolated you, years that forced you to question everything you thought you knew, Jung would tell you that you're not damaged. You're being prepared for something most people will never be equipped to handle. Jung spent his entire career studying what he called the individuation process, the journey of becoming psychologically whole. What he discovered was that this process always, without exception, required descent into darkness. The people who achieved the deepest integration, the most profound consciousness, the greatest psychological power, they were always the ones who'd been through hell and come out the other side transformed, not despite their suffering, but because of it. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about why your hardest years were necessary, what these years developed in you that nothing else could have created, and why the payoff for enduring them is about to reveal itself in ways you cannot currently imagine. Carl Jung had a personal experience that shaped his entire understanding of transformation through suffering. In his early 40s, after his break with Freud, Jung descended into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he experienced visions, heard voices, felt like he was losing his mind. He couldn't work. He couldn't function normally. He seriously wondered if he was going insane. But Jung made a crucial decision. Instead of running from this psychological crisis, he decided to enter it fully. He recorded his visions in what would become the Red Book. He dialogued with the figures that appeared to him. He allowed himself to be completely undone. And what emerged on the other side was the psychological framework that would revolutionize how we understand the human psyche. Jung realized that his breakdown wasn't breaking him. It was breaking him open. The person he'd been before wasn't big enough to contain what he was becoming. The old structures of his identity had to dissolve so something more authentic could emerge. And this pattern, he discovered, was universal. Every person who achieved psychological wholeness went through some version of this death and rebirth. What Jung found in studying his patients confirmed what he'd experienced himself. The people who came to him with the most severe suffering, devastating losses, profound betrayals, complete psychological breakdowns, these were the people who, if they did the work, achieved the most remarkable transformations. Not because suffering was inherently noble, but because suffering forced them to face what they would have otherwise avoided their entire lives. Think about what happens when life is relatively easy. You can maintain your illusions. You can avoid your shadow. You can keep telling yourself comfortable stories about who you are and how the world works. You can stay unconscious because unconsciousness doesn't cost you anything. But when suffering comes, real, bone deep, can't escape its suffering, all of that becomes impossible. The illusions shatter. The shadow demands acknowledgement. The comfortable stories reveal themselves as lies. You're forced into consciousness not because you choose it, but because unconsciousness is no longer sustainable. And this forced awakening, Jung found, often led to deeper transformation than any amount of voluntary self-work ever could. Jung documented that the hardest years served specific functions in the individuation process. They weren't random or meaningless. They were stripping away everything false so that only what was real could remain. They were burning through your defenses so you had to face your core wounds. They were isolating you so you had to develop a relationship with yourself rather than constantly seeking yourself in others. The person who loses everything learns what can't be taken. The person who's betrayed learns who they can actually trust, starting with themselves. The person who hits rock bottom learns that they contain the resources to survive what they thought would destroy them. These lessons cannot be taught. They can only be lived, and you've lived them. Here's what Jung discovered that changes everything about how you should see your difficult years. Suffering doesn't develop character uniformly. Most people who suffer become bitter, closed off, or stuck in victim narratives. But a small percentage of people who suffer become something extraordinary. They develop what Jung called psychological depth, the capacity to hold complexity, sit with paradox, and remain present with what is rather than what they wish it were. What determines whether suffering destroys you or transforms you isn't the severity of the suffering. It's whether you face it or avoid it. Jung observed that people who tried to bypass their pain, who numbed it or denied it, or immediately tried to make meaning of it, these people stayed stuck. But people who allowed themselves to fully feel the pain, who sat in the darkness without knowing how it would end, who resisted the urge to make premature sense of their experience, these people emerged transformed. You've done this. Whether you knew you were doing it or not, you've sat with pain that would have broken most people. You've faced darkness that most people would have run from. You've integrated experiences that most people would have spent their whole lives avoiding. And this has developed something in you that Jung called psychological gold, the refined consciousness that only comes through the alchemical fire of suffering. Jung was deeply influenced by alchemy, not as literal chemistry, but as a metaphor for psychological transformation. The alchemists believed they could turn lead into gold. Jung understood this as a description of the psyche's transformation. Base material, unconsciousness, wounds, shadow, being refined into gold, consciousness, integration, wholeness, through the application of heat and pressure. Your hardest years were the heat and pressure, the pain you felt, the losses you endured, the betrayals you survived, the illusions that shattered. This was the alchemical fire. And what it's been doing is burning away everything that wasn't truly you. Every false identity, every people-pleasing pattern, every belief that kept you small, every attachment that was really a bondage. The fire burned through all of it. What remains, what you are now, is something purer, more essential, more real. You've been reduced to your core self, and that core is far more powerful than the elaborate persona you constructed before the hard years began. Jung would tell you that this reduction wasn't loss, it was refinement. You're not less than you were. You're more concentrated, more potent, more essentially yourself. And here's what Jung found about people who've undergone this refinement. They develop capabilities that people who've lived easier lives simply don't possess. They can sit with others' pain without needing to fix it because they've sat with their own. They can hold space for transformation because they've been transformed. They can see through illusion because their own illusions were destroyed. They can tolerate uncertainty because they've lived through the void. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within, click below to get true self-discovery. These capabilities position you for a kind of work, and I don't just mean career, I mean your life's work, that most people can never do. Because most people haven't been forged in the fire you've been through. Most people haven't had to rebuild themselves from nothing. Most people haven't had to integrate the shadow material you've integrated. And without that forging, they simply don't have the capacity for the depth of work you're now equipped to do. Jung observed that people who had been through profound suffering often felt confused about what they were supposed to do with their lives after. The old goals that motivated them before felt shallow. The career paths that once seemed important felt meaningless. They knew they'd been fundamentally changed, but they didn't yet see how that change would manifest in their external life. This is the gap you might be in right now. You know you're different. You can feel that you've developed something through your suffering, but you can't yet see how it's going to pay off. You're standing in the space between transformation and manifestation, between having been refined and seeing what that refinement equips you for. Jung would tell you that this gap is necessary. You can't skip straight from dissolution to manifestation. There's a period of integration where what you've become has to solidify before it can be expressed, where the internal transformation has to become stable before it can generate external results. You're in the chrysalis stage. The caterpillar has dissolved, but the butterfly hasn't yet emerged. What Jung found about this chrysalis stage is that it requires trust in a process you can't see. You have to believe that the suffering served a purpose, even though you can't yet see what that purpose is. You have to trust that you're being prepared for something, even though you don't know what it is. You have to hold the tension between knowing you've changed and not knowing what that change is for. This trust is difficult because your hard years probably included betrayal that destroyed your ability to trust. You learned that people you counted on weren't reliable, that systems you believed in were corrupt, that the universe doesn't intervene to prevent suffering. So asking you to trust now feels impossible. But Jung wasn't asking you to trust others or trust the universe. He was asking you to trust the process of your own transformation. Here's what Jung discovered about what becomes possible after the hard years. You develop the capacity to help others in ways that people who haven't suffered cannot. Not because you give advice or share your story, though you might do those things, but because your presence itself becomes medicine. You've been to the underworld and returned, and people who are currently in their underworld can sense this about you. They feel safer with you because you don't need them to be okay. You're not uncomfortable with their darkness because you've integrated your own. You don't try to rush them through their process because you know that transformation can't be rushed. Your very existence becomes proof that it's possible to survive what feels unsurvivable. And this is a kind of healing that cannot be taught or learned. It can only be embodied. Jung also found that people who'd been refined through suffering developed extraordinary discernment. They could read people and situations with uncanny accuracy because they had learned to trust their perception through the hard years. When everyone told them they were wrong about someone or something, and they turned out to be right, they learned to trust their inner knowing. When their intuition warned them, and they ignored it and suffered the consequences, they learned to listen. This discernment makes you valuable in ways that aren't always obvious. You can sense dysfunction in systems before it becomes obvious. You can identify people's shadow material before they act it out. You can predict how situations will unfold based on subtle patterns most people miss. Organizations, relationships, and communities that are conscious enough to recognize this skill will seek you out. Those that aren't will find you threatening. The payoff of your hard years isn't that everything suddenly becomes easy. Jung was honest about this. Once you've been to the depths, you can never again live purely on the surface. Once you've been broken open, you can never again be satisfied with a closed, defended existence. Once you've tasted authentic living, you can never again tolerate elaborate performance. So, in some ways, your life becomes harder because you can't go back to unconscious living. But what becomes possible is connection at a depth most people never experience. Work that matters in ways that transcend material success. A sense of purpose that comes from being aligned with your authentic self, rather than chasing external validation. And a kind of internal freedom that no external circumstance can touch, because you've learned that you can survive the worst and still remain yourself. Jung found that people who had integrated their suffering often moved into what he called vocations of depth. They became therapists, healers, artists, teachers, writers, activists, not because these were prestigious careers, but because these were the roles that allowed them to use their refined consciousness. They were drawn to work that involved witnessing, transforming, or expressing the depths of human experience because that's where they now lived. But vocations of depth don't always look professional. Sometimes it's being the person in your family who can hold space for difficult conversations. Sometimes it's being the friend who others call during crisis because they know you won't fall apart. Sometimes it's creating art that comes from an honest place and helps others feel less alone. Sometimes it's raising children with an awareness that breaks generational patterns. The payoff isn't about external markers of success, though those might come. The payoff is about becoming someone who can do things that very few people can do, who can be present with intensity without being overwhelmed, who can see clearly without being cynical, who can feel deeply without being destabilized, who can love fully without losing themselves. These capabilities are worth more than any amount of money or status, even though the world doesn't always recognize their value. Jung observed something profound about people who'd been through the fire and emerged transformed. They developed what he called amor fati, love of fate. Not in the sense of believing everything happens for a reason or that suffering was somehow good, but in the sense of accepting that every experience, including the painful ones, made them who they are, and who they are is someone they would not trade to have lived an easier life. This doesn't mean you're grateful for the suffering. You can acknowledge that you wish it hadn't happened, while also recognizing that it transformed you in ways that nothing else could have. You can hate what you went through while loving who you became because of it. Jung understood that these seemingly contradictory truths could coexist in the mature psyche. If you're someone who's been through years that nearly destroyed you, Jung would tell you something crucial. You're not waiting to heal so you can finally start living. You've been living through the most intense part of your life. The hard years weren't a detour from your path. They were your path. And what they've created in you is about to become visible in ways you cannot currently imagine. You've been prepared for something specific. You don't know what it is yet because you're still in the integration phase, but you'll recognize it when it arrives because it will require exactly the capabilities that your suffering developed. It will demand the depth you've achieved. It will need the consciousness you've earned. And you'll realize that everything you went through was preparation for this. The people who will need what you've become are making their way to you right now. The opportunities that match your refined consciousness are taking shape. The work that only you can do in the way only you can do it is waiting for you to be ready. And you're almost ready. You're in the final stages of integration, where what you've become is solidifying into something stable enough to build on. Jung would tell you that the payoff isn't just one thing that happens, it's a cascade of changes that occur once you've fully integrated your transformation. Relationships shift because you're no longer tolerating dynamics that require your self-betrayal. Opportunities appear because you're finally clear enough about who you are to recognize what's actually aligned with you. Your presence becomes magnetic because people are drawn to authenticity without always understanding why. The work you're meant to do finds you because you've stopped trying to force yourself into work that was never yours. The people who are supposed to be in your life reveal themselves because you've released the people who required you to be someone you're not. The life that's actually yours begins to take shape because you finally stopped trying to live someone else's version of what your life should be. This is the payoff, not a single dramatic moment of vindication, though there might be moments like that, but a fundamental shift in the quality of your existence, from performing to being, from seeking to knowing, from chasing external validation to generating internal certainty. From feeling like you're constantly fighting upstream to feeling like you've finally found your current. Your hardest years stripped away everything that wasn't serving your highest becoming. They destroyed the comfortable lies you were telling yourself. They removed the people who were holding you back. They dissolved the identities that were too small to contain your full self. And yes, this process was agonizing.